There was a really funny moment in Oedipus on the opening night when somebody gasped in the audience at exactly the moment you'd expect them to gasp. Just as the revelation appeared. But clearly they'd never read Freud, or they managed to forget that they read Freud, or they managed to forget that this play was based by Robert Icke on Sophocles, because there was an audible which was brilliant.
It's kind of funny that someone has gone through their entire life and never sort of delved into what an Oedipal complex means, or
Exactly.
or maybe sort of had forgotten what it meant and like the true implications of it. But also just saying the words, there was something very funny in Oedipus, isn't something you say very often, but I would say that Rob Icke's production that we both saw last night actually had some relatively funny bits, considering it is a tragedy.
It has got some good laughs in it, and deliberately so. They do deliberately play up Oedipus's unruly family, and of course it's weighted with prefiguring and dramatic irony as the family meal descends into chaos, and Oedipus says things like, "You are all my brothers and sisters," and indeed they are. But it's great how Robert Icke has made it both a contemporary political thriller, and yet has also kept the sense of it being a heavyweight tragedy. I was super impressed with how well it's done and with the thought that's gone into it. And it's a gripping evening of theatre. And actually what's odd, just returning to the gasp, I always find when you're really, really watching something that has come to life in the theatre on the stage in front of you, that it's quite easy to forget the plot. I didn't forget the basics of Oedipus, but I did forget the ending of Oedipus while I was watching it. So not the revelation, but the final 2 acts, which I won't say because I think, it's been configured to surprise and devastate. And I think it's slightly unfair to give it away, but the last moments still completely took me aback. And I jumped at one point.
I would say that when shows are brought into the present day or reconfigured, especially Greek classics are recontextualized or even turned into a musical, like something like Hadestown, part of you does think maybe they're not going to play it the way that the classics do play it. Maybe it will end up in a different place. And I think, like you were saying, in Rob Icke's version of Oedipus, I was thinking at the end, maybe they won't end it the same way that it's been destined to end for millennia. And you just think maybe this will be the final iconoclastic moment where Rob Icke rewrites Sophocles. But like you say, I'm not going to spoil what does happen. But yes, I think also that is one of the early shows in a very present wave of Greek classics that seem to be coming into the West End, which is the subject of this episode of the WhatsOnStage podcast.
With me, Sarah Crompton, Chief Theatre Critic.
And me, Alex Wood, Managing Editor.
Yeah, there's a lot. And actually, just while we're on that, we'll come on to everything that's coming on, but I just want to say something that I interviewed Sophie Okonedo when she was doing Medea last year. And I said, how did you play a character where everybody knows from the very start the terrible thing about her? And I feel, because it's not on, I will say that, Medea kills her children. And that's the whole tension of the tragedy of you wait for this terrible, terrible act to happen. And she said, you have to play it assuming that nobody knows that, and assuming that you as the character in the play don't know that either. That the only way to perform Greek tragedy is to perform it as a completely unexpected set of events. And I think that's exactly what Robert Icke's Oedipus does. I think it's what Alexander Zeldin's The Other Place does, which is a version of the Antigone story. And hopefully the others that are about to come in, which are...
There is another Oedipus, isn't there? The second Oedipus, which is going to the Old Vic with Oscar winner Rami Malek and Indira Varma taking on the two lead roles. And then Electra with Oscar winner Brie Larson also coming early next year. So two very big productions sort of to round out this quartet of giant productions of Greek classics, or sort of bookend like on either side of the year end.
Greeks bearing gifts. I kept waiting to get that into a review, which I've failed to do. But, the gift they do bring, apart from anything else, as that kind of list really shows, is the amazing parts for actors. I mean, what parts? What roles to get your teeth into?
The thing that struck me watching Mark Strong and Lesley Manville was just their sense of complete assurance. They were taking on some roles that have been performed for thousands of years as if they were newly written, like you were saying about Sophie Okonedo. That just sense of complete abandon that they had. And I think that was the beauty of Rob Icke's production, is that there was all the foreshadowing, and sometimes, people were keeping mum, quite literally. That's a pun. I've been waiting to get into something as well. But at the same time, when the tragedy hits, it doesn't feel like it's preordained. And actually, this is a very secular vision of a story that actually a lot of the times is told against the canopy of hundreds of or dozens of gods watching on, waiting for this tragedy to occur. But actually, the way that Rob Icke has reimagined it as a very secular interpretation, there isn't so much of that divine presence. It's fate that comes out, and it's time, and that inevitability of tragedy instead. It's not some higher power that seems to be overseeing everything, which is really interesting, because then it almost feels like the shackles are off and anything can happen and anything can go wrong.
Yeah, he definitely sees it that way. And I think it's fascinating that it's possibly how we've come to view Greek tragedy in our age, that it doesn't just have to represent fate. You can say that you can put a character into time and leave him with choice. And I think that's the clever thing about what Rob Icke has done. And actually also Alexander Zeldin, it seems to me that they both played down the line of saying these terrible, terrible things happen, grief happens, accidents happen, but you can make choices about whether you live in the past or whether you live in the present. And both of them play very, very cleverly with the idea of time. And its sense, which you get in traditional Greek tragedy, I think, of the chorus always offering this long, long view of the actions of man. That has become, in these contemporary adaptations, a sort of undertow of thought about how time moves.
It's funny how... Yeah, no. And like in the Rob Icke production, one of the things that that was always on stage is that you had this constant countdown from the start of the play until the moment that he realizes the horrible truth about his own identity. And you could almost tell as you hit those final seconds before he realized that. So I think that Lesley Manville and Mark Strong were kind of like having to almost like land a marble inside a beer bottle or something, that you had to get the timing slap bang perfect so that it hit zero just as he realized. So they almost like slowed down their line slightly just so that moment of horror came just as 00000 was presented on the stage in front of you, which actually must take a huge amount of control to do basically 100 minutes worth of play that land with the split second accuracy that's required. So that, again, time is literally thrown straight into our faces. And we're always constantly aware of it. It's a countdown to an election in Rob Icke's production, countdown to a result of an election. But at the same time, it's also the countdown to something horrific happening. So it's always looming over us. And maybe that takes the place that the gods would normally take in terms of, something awful's coming. And normally it'd be the gods that are the ones prescribing it. Whereas here, it's just inevitability.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that both productions have played up is the notion of love. There's an astonishing line in Oedipus about you were loved, you have always been loved. And one of its great moments comes when June Watson, playing the very grave and tragic Merope, who is Oedipus's adopted mother, and a character who you never meet in Sophocles. She doesn't appear on the stage. You only hear him talking about her. Here she has an extraordinary scene with him, which is the revelation of his being adopted, which is a scene entirely about love. And also, Jocasta keeps emphasizing the idea that love is a choice, that he's been loved, that he is his own man, that his life has been full of love. And the same thing happens in Antigone, where in the other place, where the love between Antigone and Ismene, who's the sister so rarely mentioned, and in fact cut from Oedipus, is there, that the idea that they have come from a family that has the potential to love, and that love has a potential that isn't being realized, again is really interesting, and perhaps speaks to why we're looking so strongly at the Greek tragedies, that they have got this, though they're deeply formal, they've got this huge range of emotion within them, and the dealings with, massive feeling, which few modern plays really can aspire to, I guess.
It was striking, and I haven't seen the other place just yet, but hopefully I'm going to catch it later this week. But the fact that they could almost, in terms of the time that they're set in, they could literally be going on at the same time, which is quite interesting. And obviously there's a large crossover in the characters. You've got an Antigone in both, you've got a Creon in both. I mean, the character names are changed in the other place, but they're essentially modelled on the same characters from Sophocles. But at the same time, they are completely different stories told with a completely different sense of scale. Like, one of them is a very thorny domestic drama that actually has these huge, universal implications, whilst the other is attempting to be a political thriller that affects some untold yet seemingly gigantic nation with multiple time zones, where Mark Strong's Oedipus is attempting to become the leader of that country. But at the same, like you say, it's almost you're taking the same source material, but you're throwing it in completely different directions, and yet those two productions can really speak to each other, probably more so than the two productions of Oedipus might speak to each other when eventually the one goes to the Old Vic next year.
It's been odd because I feel I've been living Sophocles' life, 2,500 years later, because he wrote Antigone first, and then comes on to the two Oedipus plays, Oedipus Rex, as it's translated, or Oedipus Tyrannus, and then Oedipus at Colossus, which is the aftermath, where the family falls into the decay that forms the background for Antigone. So he himself wrote them out of order, and I have watched them out of order because Antigone opened first to me for second. But it has been fascinating seeing how the plays reflect each other, and also, of course, the great gift of adaptation for both Zeldin and Icke has been that they can prefigure and postfigure things that are happening in the other plays. There's a fair amount of Oedipus at Clonus in the other plays as a backstory, and also in Robert Icke's Oedipus, I feel that there's a certain amount of prefiguring of what happens next in terms of Antigone. So she's very much presented as the rebellious daughter, and as strong as her father, as strong-willed as her father, as obsessed with truth as her father, which of course is exactly what happens in the original Antigone, where her battle with Creon over who has the right to bury the brother becomes a kind of great argument about breaking the rules and how far truth matters, how far being allowed to feel grief matters. If you're lucky enough to see both of them, which I have been, they read across each other in very enriching ways. It's made me see Greek tragedy slightly differently, in a sense.
What's really funny is that I think we've discussed this on the podcast before, that Mark Strong has been waiting 5 years for this production to happen. He's been the driving force for it. I think Rob Icke and he worked together on the Red Barn at the National Theatre, and ever since then, I think they've been waiting for their moment to come back together. And then the pandemic happened and various scheduling conflicts got in the way. But almost, I don't think there's a better time that this Oedipus could have landed, just as a play that can exist in conversation with it is also running at the National Theatre with an equally strong cast and an equally provocative premise.
It's very true, and it was originally going to star Helen Mirren, wasn't it? I think that she signed up for it, and yet you can't imagine anyone being in that role but Lesley Manville. I mean, she just seems to fit the conception of the part so perfectly, with that mixture of vulnerability and strength that she has as an actress. And she, just feels moulded to her in a way.
What was also striking for both productions is that they've drawn some of the most exciting performers around at the moment. You've already mentioned June Watson, and obviously you've got Lesley Manville and you've got Mark Strong, but in the other place you've got Emma Darcy, you've got Tobias Menzies, you've got Alison Oliver, you've got Nina Sosanya. You know, these are probably some of the most exciting performers that could take on any play that they wanted, yet for some reason they want to go for the classics. And I do wonder if those titles still have that allure in the same way that Shakespeare might do. But even more so, I think there's a more flexibility there, that they can put their own stamp on these characters that might not be as sort of well recognised. You won't know a new line in a new version of Oedipus, but you might know every single line in Romeo and Juliet. So actually the Greek classics are familiar, yet can be completely different. So they do give that sort of meaty chance for a performer to take, you know, Medea or Oedipus or a character like that and give it their own spin.
I hadn't thought of that. And it is true that in a way you're getting the best of both worlds by putting the Greeks on, because nobody is going to do Sophocles as it actually is written anymore. So, whereas everybody feels obliged to more or less do Shakespeare as it's written, though increasingly I think, you know, he is cut and altered for contemporary ears. But I think that is true because you get that excitement of working with all the most exciting talent in theatre at the moment. I mean, Icke has worked so much in Germany, and it's so wonderful to have him back in Britain on British stages and creating things here again, because I think he is genius, really. And I think Zeldin's a genius too, and he's been working in Paris, so we've got him back. And there's that wonderful sense that you're getting something that is both entirely new, seen through the prism of these very radical theatre makers' eyes, and yet also does speak to the past and have got these epic, you know, genuinely epic roles for performers. And so it is wonderful. And you can see with the Electra coming up that, you know, for Brie Larson, it's the same idea. And that's being directed by another of my geniuses. So it's being directed by Daniel Fish, who did the Radical Oklahoma. And I can't wait to see what he makes of it. So it is really, really fascinating that these great new directors are turning their vision backwards.
It's funny when you look at the press release for that production of Electra. One of Daniel Fish's first quote is a question to say, what is ancient and what is contemporary? And I feel as though that almost strikes to what we've just been talking about. And it's Anne Carson's version of Sophocles that they're going to be doing there, which again, I think if they are, you know, playing with what does a story mean when it's thousands of years old yet told in the present day, that could be really, really juicy. So it's definitely up there with, you know, some of my most anticipated productions for 2025.
Yeah, it's going to be amazing. And also translation's interesting in this. Going back to the Medea that was on last year, it was an old translation done in the 1930s, I think, and quite traditional, quite poetic in a way that neither Icke nor Zeldin is quite as consciously. But it was you can imagine that Anne Carson's will be like that because, she's got that extraordinary sort of poetic tone. And the old translation was really rich. And that was what attracted Dominic Cook to stage it in the first place. He really liked that translation and felt that within it you could find all kinds of intonations and shades of colour in the portrayal of Medea. And what he did that was different in how he staged it was make Ben Daniels play all the male parts, which made you realise that part of the power of Medea is the way that all the men are the same while being slightly different, and that Medea really is an outsider. She's standing alone. She's a witch. She's a foreigner, and she's a woman in this kind of patriarchal society. So that was a fascinating insight using an old translation.
It is interesting how across all different media, it feels like classics are cool right now. So, I've been reading a lot of Madeline Miller whilst on holiday, and there seems to be, lots of authors that have leapt onto that similar, reinvigorating these tales like the Trojan War now readapted from different perspectives or different things like that. But also you've got that wonderful TV series Chaos that was on Netflix.
Yes, not renewed, sadly. Not
renewed, controversially, when actually it was one of the most exciting and fresh versions of the tale of Eurydice and Hades and Persephone and Orpheus. And, you've got people like Prometheus in there, played by the wonderful Stephen Delane. And it was, it just felt like a really classy show. And I think that was down to the fact that you had these characters that have been around for so long that, you mixing gods with plebs and putting them all in one big mixing pot and then coming up with some chaotic results. It was really striking just how I was completely engrossed, even though I'd seen these stories played out in shows like Hadestown on stage. Now, it's just a more ponderous 8-hour version of the similar story, but with completely different ramifications and presented in a very contemporary context. I do feel drawn when I do hear about a new version of Sophocles or a new version of something by Euripides, that actually probably more so than if I heard someone was going to retell Romeo and Juliet or retell Hamlet, I'm probably less interested in what they're doing with that compared to, these stories that do feel like there's more bandwidth to play with.
Yeah, they're both old and fresh, aren't they? And I think it is true that, again, reflecting slightly back on what we were talking about in the podcast last week about the 1950s, there was at that same time a great upsurge of interest in the classics and in what the classics could tell us and how they represented archetypes of interpretation of society. And I think people like Natalie Haynes have done the classics a great, great favour by saying, here they are, they're ancient stories, but they're entirely modern in how good they are as tales and also how much they help us to interpret and to understand the modern world, and that, archetypes become archetypes for a reason. And those tales of adventures and sorcerers and difficulties encountered and overcome go on and on, helping us to interpret a society that is increasingly complex and difficult. And you've been listening to the Lin-Manuel Miranda's latest venture, which is sort of that as well, isn't it, interestingly?
Yeah, I was going to make one final point on this. Then it was something that struck me just as we were talking, that I never learned a single sentence of Latin or Greek when I was at school. And it was never introduced to me until really after university, when I actually proactively went and found these plays and found these stories and found the contemporary versions of them. I think it's very important, really. I think studying classics feels like a very elitist thing to do. So whenever you get productions with big names or new radical Netflix shows, what they do is say, no, these are for everyone. You might not be able to read it in its original language, but the stories are still rich and exciting and they still apply to you. I think that's a really important thing.
That is interesting. I did do Latin. I didn't do Greek, but I did do Latin. And I was left with a residue of respect for Virgil, actually, in particular, and that poetic qualities that he brought to the telling of the stories. But the trouble is, it is like doing Shakespeare at school, in my experience, that there's nothing more killing of an exciting story than having to study it and parse and analyze every single line. So I think that's the trouble with classics. And yeah, it's great that they have A, survive, but B, that they are more widely available in different forms. And that if you watch something like Hadestown, that's a very honourable telling of the story, however modern it may seem. I think that is great because you can always go back. It's exactly like Shakespeare. You can change it as much as you want, but you can always go back to the original. And sometimes the actual telling pushes you back to specific things in the original. I mean, I was very taken with the Robert Icke that at the very end, Jocasta wears a green dress. And in Sophocles, she wears a green dress as well. And there is a symbolic quality to that dress. And I thought, what a lovely little nod backwards that is, of saying we're doing an entirely different thing, but we respect the original so much.
Returning to the subject of Lin-Manuel Miranda and Eisa Davis's new musical Warriors, based on the film The Warriors, so they lost the along the way. I think it came out this morning online, so you can stream it right now, but only after this podcast. Yes, it was. I was thinking about how on earth I could weave it into talking about the classics, and then a quarter of the way through, I realised it was essentially just a contemporary retelling of the Argonauts,
Wow.
because it starts with this sort of group of warriors. They're like a gang from Brooklyn who go to a sort of another part of New York and then get embroiled in a big political scandal and an assassination, and then have to try and make their way home through a lot of challenges, beating off lots of sort of rival gangs and other sort of police forces that come in and try and apprehend them or, murder them essentially. So the stakes are very high. It's a lot grittier than something like In the Heights and, not as sort of profound as something like Hamilton about the founding of America, but still very sort of like pertinent and character driven. But, there's still that Greek classic retelling, and there's a sense of tragedy. And also an intense sense of space. And I think, Lin-Manuel Miranda is someone who is not obsessed, but has a very keen interest in what a New York identity means, because it keeps returning in all his musicals, what it means to be a New Yorker. So, yeah, I think it was really fascinating, actually, to almost sort of think about the way that there's that classic undertone to what's going on in this brand new show.
I always liked, slightly showing my age, I always liked that film very much. I'd been a fan of Jason the Argonauts in the 60s version. I don't think actually I saw it as a child. I think I saw it later with the very famous special effects by Ray Harryhausen. But then I loved that film, The Warriors, and it had a cult status, I feel, when it came out. And I can see that Lin-Manuel Miranda would latch onto it and would really want to make something of it. So I think that is exciting. And it is amazing to think that these, stories just go on and on being told. I mean, I had a book of Jason and the Argonauts that I loved, and I remember I had a greenback and gold embossing. It was one of the few books I had with gold embossing. And those stories are just so terrific. And they work, again, on so many levels. That it is a joy to rediscover them, and the idea that different generations are discovering them in different forms is thrilling, and it feels like an expansion of culture rather than a reaching back into the past all the time.
It's funny how we've been talking about how Greek classics, they can combine tragedy, romance, colossal deity battling it out, huge bloodshed. And in Warriors, you've got all these, it's slightly similar in that you get all these different musical styles that come into play. So you get thrash metal, you get reggae, you get hip hop. So all is in there, and as he goes through all the different areas of New York, almost cycling through, Union Square, the Bronx, out towards Coney Island, places like that. They all have their own sound and their own flavor, just in the same way that Oedipus has a very distinct flavor from Electra, has a very different flavor to something by Virgil, but actually they all still sit within the same umbrella. And I think that actually he's really pulled that off here. I would wholeheartedly recommend anyone give it a listen. It sort of reminded me of what it would probably feel like to have listened to Jesus Christ Superstar for the first time, with zero context as to what might be happening on stage, but you still follow these characters through what they're expecting. And there's also slight contemporary twists. There's a lot of some of the characters' genders are changed, and that also brings out new themes and ideas about sort of female violence or security or being alone in the street or in a park when it's late at night or it's dark, and what that means as a woman. It all comes into play here, but actually at the heart of it is something that goes back thousands of years about just a group of individuals just trying to get home or just trying to get away from some danger and actually encountering danger on the way.
Yeah, well, I think all of this is incredibly rich, and I would definitely say I have enjoyed both Antigone, which the other plays, which I agree with you, just contains some of the most sensational acting from Emma Darcy and Tobias Menzies that I've seen, and also Oedipus with Mark Strong and Lesley Manville. If you can get tickets to go and see these things or watch them on NT at home, they are enriching examinations of both an old form and our new world, and I felt they're among the best things I've seen in theatre this year, which is quite something, 2,500 years on.
I know, we just, nothing can beat the classics, can it? That's
absolutely. Hooray for the classics.
Yes.
Up the classics. So, is that a good place to stop?
I feel like it might well be. So, on that note, if you enjoyed listening to this Classic Scene podcast, please make sure you like, follow, and subscribe. We're going to be doing this every week on the WhatsOnStage channels. Leave a comment where you can, but make sure you keep it kind and classic. And tune in next week for another very lovely episode that we have cooking up. But I think in the meantime, it's a goodbye from me, Alex Wood.
And goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.